it is through. Some just don't have anything planned. They hide their hopes and their heads in the sand.
Well, thank you very much for that very warm reception on this very cold night. My name is Joe Gary, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Broadway Buzz and Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. You know, this is an amazing show. Keep in mind, over 26 million people have seen this show. It has generated $600 million. It is one of the most produced shows in the world. You know, you can ask any school child about Joseph, and he probably will be able to sing the entire score for you. So it's had a tremendous success. It's had an amazing history. Keep in mind, it took 14 years for the show to find its way to Broadway. It went through 5 incarnations to do so. This took more effort than creating Boris Godunov. I mean, it's an extraordinary journey to success. And once it hit its Broadway mark, it became an incredible and indelible and iconic show that has been loved literally everywhere in the world. So let me go back to the beginning and, of course, introduce you to the 2 young men who were unknown at the time, Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber. And they would create Joseph as a 15-minute cantata for a boys' school in London. And it would move from that to its preeminence in the musical theater. It's been an extraordinary journey. But before we talk specifically about the show, let me go back and talk about these 2 men who would literally transform the musical theater. So let us go back to 1965 when these 2 men met. Andrew Lloyd Webber was a young, aspiring composer. He wanted to be the next Richard Rodgers. He had memorized all of the American Broadway musicals. He had seen South Pacific 12 times to show you what a determined child he was, that once he would see a show, he had this little theater that he created out of cardboard. It was called a toy theater. But he made his theater very, very sophisticated. He used his old record player as a turntable, so all of his sets could, you know, have immediate turntable effects. And he would reconstruct a show. He wasn't happy to simply see South Pacific. He had to have the score, take it apart, see what it was that gave that music the special magic that it had. And he literally sort of decomposed Richard Rodgers. And so this was a child that was unlike someone who just loved the musical theater. He wanted to be the next Richard Rodgers. There was no question about it. And happily, he grew up in this very eccentric family. His father was a church organist in London, very revered actually, and he was a very distinguished teacher who taught music theory and composition. He had always wanted to be an aspiring composer, but because the Second World War had happened and then he had a young family, and of course he had to support his family, and becoming a composer wasn't a possibility. So he was very, very intense on making certain that his son, Andrew Lloyd Webber's dreams would come true. So there is this eccentric family. His mother taught piano. She would pick up people, if she thought they were gifted, she wouldn't only take them on as a student, she would bring them home and make certain that she worked with them, you know, day and night in perfecting them. Actually, she found a young man that she said had so much promise as a pianist. She looked at Andrew and said, "You don't have it, kid. I'm not going to spend my time with you," her own son. But she found this young boy that she developed into being an extraordinary world-class concert pianist. He went on and won the Tchaikovsky piano competition, which is no small feat. But again, he just came and moved into the house and was part of the household. Also in that household was a brother to Andrew Lloyd Webber named Julian Lloyd Webber, and Julian played the cello. Now, Mama realized that Julian had real talent, so she spent a great deal of time cultivating his musical talent on the cello, and he's gone off to be one of the great cellists of his generation. And it was very clear to her that she just sort of let Andrew on his own, knowing that he would come up with what he wanted to be. And Andrew decided very early on, as a boy of about 7, that he was going to be the next great musical theater composer. And of course, that's exactly what happened. But the journey is going to be really amazing. And I want to share that journey with you because part of it had to do with meeting Tim Rice. So, all right, we have Andrew Lloyd Webber, this young boy determined to be the next great composer, not only of Broadway, but of England. Keep in mind, in England at this time, we really had Lionel Bart, who had done Oliver, so the English really relied on the Americans for their great musical. And Andrew Lloyd Webber said from the very beginning, I'm going to change this. England is going to become the epicenter of where musicals are created, and of course, that's exactly what would happen. But very early on, when he was ready to go to college, he knew that he had to work with a gifted lyricist, that you could not only write music, you had to have a lyricist of equal importance. So, enter Tim Rice. Now, two young men could not be more unalike. Andrew Lloyd Webber was shy, sort of diffident, had this enormous self-confidence, and obviously had this incredible musical gift. And keep in mind, one of the things that made Andrew Lloyd Webber so special was because his family was so imbued with classical music, that was a part of his DNA. So classical music would always play a part in his career as he moved more toward writing operas than Broadway musicals. It was very clear that it was really his past coming out. On the other hand, Tim Rice was absolutely unlike that. Tim Rice was 4 years older than Andrew Lloyd Webber, and his dream was to become the next Elvis Presley. Tim Rice knew absolutely nothing about the musical theater. He didn't really care about the musical theater, but he had an absolutely encyclopedic knowledge of popular music. And so everything that was hip, everything that was cutting edge, everything that was leading music in a new direction, Tim Rice was right there. He would go to every sleazy bar in Soho as a kid with fake ID so he could hear the leading new wave singers of the day. So, you know, he was a really hotshot kid who actually was quite successful with the ladies, and there was Andrew Lloyd Webber who was not. So they're this very interesting team of opposites. And they met through an agent, and the end result was they knew right away that they had this chemistry together because Andrew Lloyd Webber had this sort of phenomenal taste in music and was able to tap into Puccini and all the great composers of the day to find his musical references. And there was Tim Rice, who could recite and perform any song that Elvis Presley had ever sung. So this group worked perfectly together. Tim Rice moved into this family compound. The Lloyd Webbers lived in a very large, rambling apartment in South Kensington. Even Grandma lived there, and about 10 Siamese cats. So therefore, you know, the birthing of cats did not really happen by accident. He was inundated with cats all his life. So he moved into this eccentric sort of bohemian household where music was playing. Think what it would be like to have been a neighbor of of this erratic family, because people were playing the piano at all hours of the day or night, and the cello was being played. And Grandma was living there also, who was very hard of hearing and had the television on the highest decibels possible, and all the cats screeched. So I mean, this was really quite the environment. But Tim Rice also lived there, and they wrote their first musical. Keep in mind, over a 10-year period, Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber would transform the musical theater with Jesus Christ Superstar, with Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and with Evita. It would totally transform the way musicals were created. It would switch the whole epicenter of creation to London, and we would then have, 20 years of magnificent musicals that the two men would create separately after their careers broke up after Evita. But let me just go back to the beginning and show you how this evolution happened. It was always Tim Rice who had the ideas. Andrew Lloyd Webber's ideas were a little too esoteric, a little too offbeat, a little too out of the mainstream to really make initial impressions. But here is Tim Rice, who was so hip to everything that was pop and contemporary. He knew every slang expression, while Andrew Lloyd Webber was reading 19th century novels. You know, here's Tim Rice, who's really on the street seeing the world. So initially, they decided to write the well-made musical. And it was a musical called The Likes of Us. And it was written in 1965. Now, you don't know this show because it wasn't really performed until, actually, we have to jump to 2005, when finally Andrew Lloyd Webber took it out of his bottom drawer and presented it at a music festival that he holds every year at his brilliant estate. And he presented The Likes of Us. It was recorded and it went into release so people could do the show. But basically what it was sort of a reworking of Richard Rodgers, and it was sort of a reworking of Lionel Bart, who had created Oliver. In fact, the story was much too similar to the story of Oliver. The Likes of Us was about Dr. Bernardo, who in real life in the 19th century was a doctor who picked up orphans on the street and created a home for these homeless children, and was very paternal and was a tremendous humanitarian and did a remarkable thing in that period of the Industrial Revolution when the world was so incredibly cruel, and especially to children. And so the end result was, it all sounds, even though I'm describing it to you now, much too much like Oliver. And the problem was they could never get any momentum with it. They could never get anyone interested in producing it. Keep in mind, Andrew Lloyd Webber's idea was that it would immediately go to the West End and he would have a major international hit. Well, you know, that isn't how young artists start in the musical theater. So that didn't work. They couldn't sell it, it wasn't commercial. And even when they finally released it in 2005, there are some lovely songs from the show. Some of you may remember a brilliant album that Julian Lloyd Webber, the cellist brother, created. It was called Variations. And in it, there's a brilliant cello solo that's one of the most haunting melodies you've ever heard that came from The Likes of Us. So luckily for them, this didn't happen. Because if that had happened, it was tapping into things that they weren't skilled in. I mean, it was very clear that Andrew Lloyd Webber should not be copying Richard Rodgers, and he should not be copying Lionel Bart. He had his own brilliant vision about music. And in the same way, Tim Rice, who really didn't have a background in musical theater, should not be writing a libretto and a storyline for a traditional Broadway musical, when he really hadn't seen any Broadway musicals. So lucky for them that The Likes of Us didn't work. The next thing that would happen, I mean, they were struggling, trying to write single songs. Tim Rice had an in the publishing business and knew people in the commercial music business, so he kept trying to have Andrew Lloyd Webber write single songs that they would try and produce, but to no significant avail. Finally, a choir master at a boys' school named Alan Duggett was his name, and it was a preparatory school for young boys, and he wanted to have a sort of 15-minute end of term, and he called it, I want a pop sonata. And so he said, you know, you can pick any topic, and, but I want it to be something that will really work for young boys to sing, and their parents would be the audience. So Andrew Lloyd Webber, again, moved off in very much the wrong direction. And why I'm telling you all this is, it's so interesting to see how these two men would so strongly impact one another and give one another the ability to become the world-class artists that they would become. Andrew Lloyd Webber thought about doing a sort of James Bond thriller, and at the time the Cuban Missile issue had happened, and so he thought that might be an interesting theme, but not really for young boys at an end-of-term celebration. And it was Tim Rice who said, well, you know, I just went to the Bible and I found this really hip story about Jacob and his sons, one of which was Joseph, who had this very magical coat. And so that would become the idea, going to the Bible, going to Genesis, taking a story and then treating it in a very apocryphal way And so this would be the basis of their success. Now again, to show you the difference in thinking, I went back and read the old journals, and Andrew Lloyd Webber said, this is a great idea. We will call it, based again on his theater experience, we will call it Pal Joseph, based of course on Pal Joey. And they said, no, I've got an even better idea. You know, he loved How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, so he said, we'll call it How to Succeed in Egypt Without Really Trying. And Tim Rice said, no, this is not the way to go with this. We should call it Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Keep in mind, this tapped into everything that was happening in the 1960s. The whole hippie movement, the whole idea of psychedelic clothes, the whole idea of sort of camp apocryphal treatments. I mean, keep in mind the idea of young sort of hippie-like kids writing a cantata based on Genesis and presenting it at a very respectable boys' school. So this happened, and they wrote 15 minutes of material, and they used a boys' choir to sing. And in it, Tim Rice still wanted to be the superstar, so he wrote a role for himself in it that no child could play, and he was going to play the Pharaoh. And who did he play it like? Of course, Elvis Presley. And that, of course, would be the way that number has always been done. Well, it played at that school, and the parents were delighted with it, and it was a kind of, it caused a tremendous buzz, but nothing really happened. This is 1965. Tim Rice's father was in the audience, and he said, I am not going to let my son go and be unnoticed as a composer. I am going to find a way for a larger audience to see this. So he was the organist at a very large church in Westminster. And so he turned over the church. There's a great hall there called the Central Hall, Westminster, and it seats 2,000 people. So he turned it over to the boys and said, expand this into 25 minutes and we'll find 2,000 people to come and see it. And they did. And what happened in that showing, a critic from one of the most prestigious London papers was there, and he wrote this article saying, this is an incredible work. The music is so eclectic, it's so pop, it's so hip. They're taking a religious story and treating it in a very hip way. This is monumental. And so it gave them a lot of attention. Agents came to them. Suddenly they had money, and they had to come up with their next idea. They thought Joseph would just be this little piece that schools might do, and they would print up materials so that they could distribute it with rights, so schools could present this 25-minute cantata. But it was not yet over. But something would divert them for several years. And let me talk to you about what happened. They then decided they needed to have another project. So again, they went back to the Bible, and they decided to focus on Richard the Lionheart, and they called it Richard, Come Home, Your Country Needs You. The idea was Richard was always out on the Crusades, and England was falling apart while he was out doing that. And that was their idea for their next project. But something would transform this. An agent came to them and said, I don't really like your idea very much, and I can't do anything with that. Go back to the Bible and see what else you come up with. And so Tim Rice came up with the last days of Jesus' life. And so they decided that they would focus on those final days of the life of Jesus. I mean, this is getting, right to the heart of most religions. And then to treat it with rock music was such a shocking idea. And so they started to play with this idea. And initially, Andrew Lloyd Webber came up with the title Christ with an exclamation point. He was obviously thinking of Oliver with an exclamation point. And when people said, but that's too derivative, and he said, but it's Oliver with a twist. So in any case, they threw that idea out. And then he came up with the idea of calling it Jesus. That seemed too apocryphal to call it Jesus. And again, it was Tim Rice who came up with that brilliant idea. He had just read an article about Andy Warhol who said, everybody is a superstar for 15 minutes. And so it became Jesus Christ Superstar. And again, what happened with that show, it was created in the most unusual way. It was created as a concept album. It was put down on record. And so they kept writing songs. They would introduce individual songs. It didn't generate a lot of interest when they wrote it song by song. But soon they had a whole song cycle of Jesus Christ Superstar. And when that recording came out, I mean, it really transformed. If you remember that period, if you're as old as I am, and you remember this period in 1970, when that concept album of Jesus Christ Superstar came out, everyone in the world was addicted to it. And especially young people were so drawn to it. But again, religious people stood up and said, this is what young people want to hear. They're asking Jesus questions. And the lyrics were very provocative and very sassy. And so religion stood up in its defense, but then an equal number of religious leaders said, shameful, damnation, send them to hell, burn all the records. The Jewish people, some people stood up and said, it's very salacious and anti-Jewish. And so much controversy was created about Jesus Christ Superstar. It's still only a record now, that it became a sensation. And when it came to America, I mean, it swept America. America embraced it more than Europe did at first. And so the end result was they had this extraordinary show that was such an amazing hit. Meanwhile, I want you to remember there's Joseph still off there being done by lots of little groups. They keep writing one or two more songs for it, but all their attention is on Jesus Christ Superstar. And this is what would make them superstars. What they had to worry about in America, there started to be pirated editions of Jesus Christ Superstar. And keep in mind, there's an issue called grand rights. And grand rights, when you write a traditional musical, when you copyright it, you're writing a storyline with music, so you copyright the whole thing, the story and the music, and that's called the grand rights. But when they were creating Jesus Christ Superstar, they were just getting copyrights for each song as they wrote them, and there were no grand rights in place. So what happened when the album became such a great hit in America, people started doing concert versions, rock concert versions of Jesus Christ Superstar live, and they would invert two songs and say, well, we're not doing what the album does. We're paying ASCAP fees, which are very minor compared to the royalties you pay for a musical. So it started exploding all over America. There were literally hundreds of illegal productions. Ohio was one of the hotbeds of this, incidentally. One of the major production companies in the early 70s was in Ohio, and they were generating these shows that were playing in stadiums all over America, making enormous sums of money. So finally, they presented the Broadway version of the show, which was very controversial. It was directed by Tom O'Horgan, who was sort of the high priest of the underground theater at the time. He had directed Hair, and he was sort of the epitome of new wave theater and new wave musicals. And so when Jesus Christ Superstar opened, it was an extraordinary success, and then played everywhere in the world. And meanwhile, here is Joseph, still undeveloped. So this whole thing is happening, 1970, 1971 with Jesus Christ Superstar. In 1972, a wonderful English director named Frank Dunlap took Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and he took it to the Edinburgh Festival, and he presented it not with children, but presented it in a very sort of camp, very sort of sassy production that was spectacular, and it was a hit of the Edinburgh Festival. But it wasn't long enough to be an entertainment by itself. So he added medieval English mystery plays, which are stories of the Bible that were told in medieval periods. And so the first act were these medieval mystery plays done brilliantly, and then there was this very bizarre, theatrical, spectacular production of Joseph happening. But still, it wasn't enough to be a whole evening. He moved it back to London to the Young Vic, where they played it. They had Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice write a new first act for it about Jacob, the father of the story, but it really didn't fall into place. They took it to the West End, and they finally dropped the first act and just played Joseph. It still wasn't long enough, so what they would do is, at the end in the curtain call, they would reprise almost all of the songs again. But the audience didn't care. They loved it. And so, here it is still in a very imperfect form, but still the audience was saying, we love it, we want more of this. And so finally, it moved to America. where it was developed by two young women, and it played at the Arena Stage in Washington, D.C., and they encouraged Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice to write 3 more songs for the show. So finally, they had a full evening, and then they took it to Broadway. So this is now 1982. And in all of the promotion, they said, you know, after Jesus Christ Superstar comes another triumphant show, Joseph. Well, Joseph, of course, had been written many years before Jesus Christ Superstar, and Joseph was the real reason that Superstar happened. So in any case, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat would find its home on Broadway in 1982, and there would be literally productions of it everywhere in the world ever since. It found its proper form, it found its proper length, it found its proper story, but it is one of the rarest and most unusual ways for a musical to be developed. Keep in mind, even in its 15-minute form, it was loved. And then as it kept expanding, you know, people didn't care that it wasn't yet finished. They loved it. It was so beguiling to them, and it was so hip and contemporary. So when you see this show, you know, they use a children's choir, and you know, the children's choir brings back the memories of the earliest form of the show when it was really created for children, and it brings about a tremendous kind of innocence. And then yet the production itself can be very sassy and a little bit sexy and a little bit outrageous, and the lyrics are still enormously contemporary and they still sizzle. And so the end result is everyone is pleased by this delightful show. And it has the most unusual development of a musical I've ever seen happen, and yet it stands as a triumph. Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice would go on to do Evita, and that would basically end their career together. They worked 10 years together. They created extraordinary work. All of their work started with concept albums first, unlike the way we develop. You know, we spend so much time talking about how musicals are developed in workshops, etc. This was all done in a record studio. And actually, it was a brilliant way of going. Tim Rice has written a wonderful book called Oh, What a Circus, which is his autobiography up to the completion of Evita. He's just about to finish the second biography about life up to the present. But in light of that, he talked about the idea that they really broke all of the rules. They didn't develop a show the way shows are developed. They developed it as music rather than as theater, and yet they found this phenomenal combination that people have used and copied literally for 40 years. So their partnership ended after Evita. They came back together for the Queen's 60th anniversary, and they wrote a work called Cricket for the Queen's birthday. They then took that music from Cricket and put it in Sunset Boulevard and Aspects of Love. They then came together just recently in 2012 and did a new working of The Wizard of Oz, where they wrote 10 new songs for it. It opened in London to mixed reviews. They're developing a production of it in Canada now. And after that show, Tim Rice had a press announcement, and he said, you know, our partnership is really over. This ends our relationship. And what's really sad about that, while both men have gone off and have had extraordinary careers, keep in mind, Andrew Lloyd Webber has created Cats, and he's created Phantom of the Opera, and you know, the list goes on. And then on the other hand, Tim Rice has collaborated with Elton John and Alan Menken, and he's created brilliant works. Most recently, his show Aladdin is just about to open on Broadway, but his shows include The Lion King and King David and extraordinary works. So both of them have had remarkable careers, and yet, you know, together they created this very special kind of magic that would transform our musical theater. So when you go to Joseph and you see all that mixture of country western music and Elvis songs and sort of French chanson type songs and the whole mixture of sort of camp music put together, you realize this would open the door to almost 40 years of extraordinary work. And this phenomenal big productions that were created with Jesus Christ Superstar and Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, all of this would lead our theater in a totally different direction for almost 40 years. So you're really seeing a groundbreaking show that's as pertinent today as it was. So I hope you will put on your coat of many colors and have an extraordinary evening tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.